This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, producer of the show. This week, Mike and David are joined by Genevieve Collins, Texas State Director for Americans for Prosperity, to discuss the state's newly passed Education Savings Account bill, an ambitious move that could make Texas a national school choice leader. Then, on the Research Minute, Amber shares a study from Michigan showing that simply being flagged to repeat third grade can boost reading scores, even when students aren't actually held back. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming this week's special guest, Genevieve Collins. Genevieve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Yeah, Genevieve is the Texas State Director for Americans for Prosperity and was very much involved in the big effort to pass an education savings account program in Texas, which did happen and which we will talk about in a moment. But first, let's welcome in my co-host, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Always a pleasure. Hi, Genevieve.
Yeah, well, this is monumental, Genevieve. We are excited to have you on the show. Those of you that listen regularly know that we're fans of school choice. Maybe me, I'm a little more comfortable going all the way on private school choice than David, but also have some concerns with how some of these ESA programs have been designed. And so we're going to talk all about that. Let's do that on Ed Reform Update. All right, so Genevieve, first of all, congratulations. I know this was a huge multi-year effort. I imagine that lion behind you for people watching on YouTube is a sign of how ferocious you had to be in some cases getting this across the finish line. Some people have been following the twists and turns maybe as this bill went through the Texas legislature. So first, just explain kind of how did it come out at the end? What are we looking at in terms of this private school choice bill in Texas?
So SB2, I would say this has been a 40-year crusade, with the last 2.5 years feeling like we are back in like the Battle of the Bulge trenches. That is what the last 2.5 years have felt like. But SB2, Senate Bill 2, is now signed into law by the governor of Texas, which is the largest universal education school choice program in America. Couple of the highlights are that, one, this has been funded to the tune of $1 billion, that's billion with a B, $1 billion for essentially about 100,000 slots, education savings account slots or opportunities. The bill was really written to focus on students with disabilities in terms of eligibility, students with disabilities, in addition to students in low-income families. That's really it was defined at about 62,500 for a family of four. Then middle-income families, and that's about 150,000. That'll be 80% of the eligibility. And then there was also 20% of the eligibility for students income families that make more than 150,000. Some of the other highlights is that there's a nationally norm referenced assessment. There's also opportunities for homeschool families to receive an ESA funded to up to $2,000. And ESAs, from a structural standpoint, will be administered and implemented by our state comptroller. That's basically the state's chief financial officer for other states, or for other folks that may not know what the comptroller does. But this is our state chief financial officer. He or she, we currently have an election for our comptroller, will administer the program, audit the program, and ensure that all expenditures are directed by parents towards tuition, textbooks, uniforms, transportation, all sorts of therapies. So being able to behavioral therapies or special needs therapies, there will be all sorts of approved educational expenses that the comptroller will oversee. And last but not least is that our school choice program is funded because Texas is very blessed and we have a surplus in our state budget. Our state will fund it through our surplus account, not through the general revenue account, which funds public schools. So we're able to fully fund public schools in addition to fully fund this creation of an education savings account and or school choice program in Texas.
All right, great. That was super helpful. Thank you, Genevieve.
That was a lot. So sorry.
It is a lot. And let's unpack some of it. Okay, let's start with the money. That's what everybody's really focused on, right? First off, very interesting with the $2,000 for the ESA for homeschoolers. I mean, I like that. I think it makes sense that you don't need to give homeschoolers as much money as you do for parents that are using their dollars for tuition. So in Arizona, let's say, which is kind of the libertarian dream of an ESA program, the least restricted, but it's $8,000 per child for anything. And arguably that's too much of a windfall on the homeschooling side. All right, so $2,000 for homeschooling, up $10,000 for private school tuition. The targeting, this is where I get confused, and maybe it's because I think that it did change over the course of the bill. So this requirement where you say, the first tranche is for special needs and low income, then there's a second tranche that's for middle income and then above. But 100,000 slots. So first of all, is this into perpetuity that this is going to work this way, or is this just the first year? And then, let's assume more people want this than there are slots, right? Including every wealthy family in Texas with kids already in private schools is going to apply for this. Why wouldn't they? Anybody with kids already in private schools would apply for it. So then is it a lottery? How does that work?
Well, we're going through the rulemaking process. We're about to go through the rulemaking process now. So unfortunately, I don't have as many specifics as I think we all would like, myself included. From my point of view and what Americans for Prosperity, what we advocated for was making sure that students with disabilities and low-income students were prioritized first. That should be the intent. That's our principle, is fundamentally making sure that students who need a different path or a more customized path for their own education get it first, and that they're not trapped in failing schools. That is most important. And so that was what we did at AFP, is make sure that our grassroots activists, our volunteers, as well as our team, that we really carried the water on making sure that that message came first and foremost. And I did omit one very important piece that I forgot, sorry, but students with disabilities are able to receive up to $30,000 for their education.
Right, that makes sense.
So it's not just $10,000, but they're able to receive up to $30,000 because it's so variable on how much support a child may need if they have severe disabilities. Okay, all that being said, making sure that the right kids get the eligibility and they get out of a bad situation first is primary. With 100,000 slots, I do not personally forecast that many middle income or upper income families they may be, quote, eligible, but they will not receive. I think we need to make sure that the state does what's right for the kids that are in, poor schools. And that those kids really get prioritized. And I think that that's really the intention of this bill. But to your point, we haven't gone through the rulemaking process, and we still have a lot of fine details to sort out.
Okay, no, but fair enough. And that's interesting. Of course, look, I'm a fan of that targeting. I think that makes sense. It also means, if it works as intended, close to 100,000 kids moving from public schools to private schools, which, if you care about competitive effects, trying to put pressure on the public schools to improve, that could and should help, versus again, a subsidy for families already sending their kids to private schools who are going to tend to be wealthier. Now, there's going to be some low income and middle income families, who maybe win a voucher, who have been scrounging around to try to pay that, a Catholic school tuition, let's say. But again, in the out years, is it just we don't know yet? Like, I guess the question is, it's oversubscribed, and is the expectation that then it gets to be a much bigger program? You're starting at $1 billion, it could go much higher, or not. And that's kind of TBD, I guess.
It is TBD. So there's over 6 million kids in the state of Texas.
Yeah.
So, with 100,000 slots in the first year, which will begin in 2026, 2027 school year, I fully anticipate, and I think the legislature fully anticipates, that there will be a wait list.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing is we have a biannual legislature, so we meet every 2 years. So making sure that, we have enough funding, or that we prioritize funding for this program in 2027, when the legislature meets again, will be very key. I think from the political side of the fight, what those who are against ESAs or school choice, they're afraid that this bill is the camel's nose under the tent, and that this is just going to expand choice across Texas and, quote, defund public schools, which we all know is not the case. Data proves that. But I believe that Texas will expand this program.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, I believe that this will also enhance the education and entrepreneurship that's already blossoming here in Texas, where you've got Vela Fund, you've got all these micro schools, you've got Catholic schools that want to expand across the state and see a real opportunity to meet their current population and their current congregations throughout the state, that now that they can do more. And they were very supportive of this bill as well. So I think that we're going to see a real blossoming of innovation and education entrepreneurship through this, in addition to a pretty substantial wait list.
Yeah. David, anything on your mind?
Well, listen, I am not offended by anything that I've heard. You have not given me a whole lot.
Oh, no, I need to do better.
No, many of our guests are offensive, but you have not offended me.
David.
Here's what I want to hear, right? I want to hear that the state has plans to evaluate the impact of this program, meaning that it evaluates the impact both on participants and on students in traditional public schools. Because, first of all, I think, there's a decent chance that the effects are good. If they are, we should talk about that. And if they're not, that's also important information. So that's one thing I want to hear more about. And then I'm really greedy. The other thing that I want to hear that I don't think I've heard, and is probably a bigger ask, is I really want to hear that the state is planning to use these data that parents are sending, I think to the comptroller or to whoever, to generate some sort of growth measure. As I understand it, these are nationally norm referenced, tests, right? And so, yes, there are technical challenges associated with this. But Texas is a lovely state, has lots of smart people in it. I believe that it can do this. I want to hear that there is going to be some sort of effort to inform parents about how it's going, right? Because broadly speaking, I think parents are a force for good in their kids' education. I think they know more about their kids. I think they are advocates for their kids. But I also think that everybody can get it wrong sometimes. And so I think it would behoove us to try to educate parents and just sort of give them the information they need to know that they're doing right by their kid. So that is my main comment. And if you could at least address sort of like the first half of that, right? Which is this going to be evaluated? Will we know, 5 or 10 years how well it's working? Is that something that's in the works?
Well, let me tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah, I love that. No, listen, I have no problem hearing what I want to hear.
Well, I love that you're direct about it. It makes my life a lot easier. Yes, these are tax dollars that are going to be appropriated to school choice programming. So we have to report out how children are doing. and I think fundamentally across the legislature, RD, whatever, everyone wants to do that because we want to make sure that kids are doing better. That's the whole point. There is a lot that is still that we're going to be working through the summer on the rulemaking process because parent involvement will be a very key fundamental of how do we ensure parent and student satisfaction with the program or with the administration of an ESA? How do we ensure parent and student satisfaction on growth and how those students perform in their new school? All of that is going to be part of how this bill continues to evolve now that it's in its post-legislative life. So there is a huge aspect of parents being involved in this. And more importantly, how are we reaching out to the families that are in low income areas that may not have as much access or consistent access to Wi-Fi or may not know about the programs? How are we reaching into communities? These are conversations that are already happening with a broad coalition of pro-school choice advocates across the state. So there is definitely going to be a lot in there. I think the big thing is there's still a few unknowns that are kind of tangential to what you mentioned around student growth. One is that the state is currently looking to maybe get rid of our end of year high stakes STAR test. So that's our big end of year test. Teachers hate it, parents hate it, kids are really anxious about it. And it's not produced good results for the majority of Texas.
All right,
So,
Genevieve, you just offended David and me.
oh no, yeah, so good. I did my job then. No, but they're looking at how do we really measure student growth more effectively and report that out in real time. So we're still trying to sort through. There's a lot of legislation that still has yet to be played out. But that's really kind of how we're going to be talking about growth and figuring out what's the right way to measure academic growth.
Yeah. Hey, Genevieve, can I ask a question about the politics here? You know, for several years now, folks in the school choice movement have been making this case that, you know, in red states, we had been going about it wrong by making the sort of left argument for choice. It's for poor kids, it's for, you know, disadvantaged kids. And you know, while that was appealing maybe to some people, it didn't actually give, say, Republican legislators a way to bring home the bacon for their own constituents, right? So then the shift was, hey, let's go to universal choice. Let's talk about how everybody should have access to this. That is something that suddenly shifts the politics on this. Let's do ESAs and not just vouchers so that rural legislators can say, hey, for my homeschooling families, there's a benefit here. So it's interesting in Texas that it sounds like, I mean, a lot of the rhetoric I used to hear sounded like that new red state strategy, that this was going to be a universal program. And in the end, it ends up to be, at least at first, much more targeted. So I don't know. I'm just curious, like how you think about the politics in that, you know, how important is it? Is it important that there's this possibility of universal choice dangling out there? What do you think?
Absolutely. For us here at AFP, having universal built into the statute was paramount. We want the program to eventually be able to be open to as many students that want it, you know, however many millions of kids that may be. The reality is we have so many kids in Texas that if we're going to begin a very innovative approach for Texas, may not be innovative for other states, but a new approach for Texas, we have to start small and we have to get it right from the beginning. So doing a much more targeted approach and really being laser focused on making sure the right kids get first eligibility and access to it so we can learn and we can expand that program over time so that it becomes genuinely universal. That is where most people want to go. It's too hard to do that in the first year of its implementation. And with, you know, 6 million kids, if you're going to do something this transformative, you need to get it right from the beginning.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. Well, we will be watching. I will say, Ohio, where of course Fordham does a lot of work, is only 20 years ahead of you on this front. We also have a $1 billion private school choice program, but it did take us 2 decades to get there. So this is a big one to start on day one at that size. And I really appreciate you coming on and helping us understand it. I have to say, I am more enthusiastic about this program now than I was 20 minutes ago. So thank you.
Good. Well, there's more to come. I think that, I'll leave you with this thought. Texans really love Texas, as you both know. And we love talking about Texas. I'm a 7th-generation Texan.
Oh, yeah.
We want to make sure that if we're really serious about doing a program this size and at this magnitude, that we get it right. Because we know that there's going to be a lot of eyes and a lot of targets on our back if we fail. And so Texans take that really seriously, that we want to get this right from the beginning. If we're going to do it, let's go big, but let's do it really right. And so I think that this will be a really interesting and evolving policy as it gets put into place. But you can count on us to do our best to try to get it right from the beginning.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Genevieve Collins, Texas State Director for Americans for Prosperity. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thrilled to be here.
Now it's time for everyone's favorite, Amber's Research Minute. Amber, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mike.
Woo, a lot is happening on the school choice front. The Texas bill enactment, that is a big deal. And
big deal.
Now we've also got maybe a federal tax credit scholarship program in the reconciliation bill, or it is in the bill. We'll see if it stays in the bill. We might have religious charter schools. I mean, this is crazy.
Right. And more money for charter schools in the charter school fund.
And more money for charter schools in the charter school fund, which, it begs the question. They found $60 million.
They did.
And I am wondering, where did they find that money? I don't know. I think journalists are trying to figure that out.
I see that.
Yeah. I do wonder, when everything went down with IES, one thing that I wondered about was, the big title programs, like Title II and the others, I believe there's some provision where you can shave off some percentage of money for evaluations related to that title. And so way back when I was there was we did some teacher quality oriented evaluations with Title II money.
Yes.
Right. But you don't have to spend that money. Right. That's the kind of thing that you're going to or you can just dump it back into the formula and that's fine. There is some flexibility if you know your way around 400 Maryland Avenue Southwest. So maybe, I don't know, we'll see. I hope that's legal, that whatever they did, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but good for charters.
Good for charters.
Yeah.
Sure. Right. We will reporters will continue to follow up.
Yes. Follow the money. All right. Well, what do you have for us this week on the research front?
We're looking at the impact of third grade reading retention policies. It's not the first time we've looked at this, but I like the study because it kind of gave us some additional nuance. It's going to look at test scores and student groups and how this policy rolled out in Michigan. As of 2025, 14 states had third grade promotion policies tied to reading proficiencies as measured by state test. We can get into this in discussion, but some states are clawing that back, so on and so forth. But Michigan had the policy in 2016, and they're studying 2 cohorts in the study. First time third graders in 2020, 21, and 21, 22. They were the first cohorts that were subject to the retention policy under this new law in 2016. Their cutoff was around the 5th percentile, and having that cutoff paved the way for a regression discontinuity study. These are fairly popular when you've got cutoffs. They're comparing children who scored just below the test score cutoff to otherwise identical children who scored just above that cutoff. Children who scored below it were flagged as eligible for retention, and their families had to be informed by a letter from the state that was their eligibility. And then the law required schools to provide early assessment and interventions for struggling readers from K through third grade. And this was like individualized reading plans and monitoring and small group and one-on-one tutoring, that sort of thing. But districts also had leeway to use good cause exemption. If students were English learners, say, they had an IEP, they'd previously been retained, they were enrolled in public school for less than 2 years, they had a parent requesting promotion, advocating for it, or they could do a portfolio of student work that demonstrated mastery. Lots of good, what is that called? Good cause exemptions. So one little quiz question embedded in here: what percentage of third graders in 20, 21, and 21, 22 do we think scored below that cutoff were actually held back?
And this was during the pandemic.
It was.
Oh, I mean, so you want a percentage of the total or percentage of the kids who were eligible for this?
We want the percentage of the third graders who were eligible. They actually scored below.
Yeah. And how many were held back? 10%.
I'm going to go higher. I'm going to say 25%.
6%.
Oh,
6.
wow. Wow.
Okay.
And by the way, this was at a time when I was saying everybody should be held back because it was the pandemic. Nobody was going to school, at least in blue areas.
Yes. All right, they had an intent to treat analysis that includes all the kids flagged but not necessarily retained. And they found that being flagged increased the chances of being retained by only 3 percentage points, roughly. Nevertheless, being flagged raised students' reading test scores in the following year by 0.045 standard deviation. That's modest, but it's meaningful. And then the subgroup analyses indicated that the advantaged kids tend to benefit a little bit more, in part because they were more likely to have an IEP the following year. And then they calculate the impact of following the policy, even though that hardly ever happened in Michigan. So they are doing the effect if students were retained when they were scored below the cutoff, but not if they scored above it. So how it was supposed to go. That estimate was 1.3 standard deviation, which is just a tad improbable, given that typical year-to-year growth is 0.36 standard deviation. So then they pondered what's going on, and they figured that districts were required to provide literacy supports to students eligible for retention, even if they are promoted to 4th grade. And in fact, there were big positive impacts on reading scores, even in districts where no students were retained, revealing that factors other than retention, perhaps all those supports, were driving the gains. And then they had some survey data, and they were actually able to show that principals said that kids who were flagged for retention received similar levels of support, regardless of whether they were retained or promoted. And then I guess the bottom line is, even though other studies have shown that retention laws move the needle, especially in the lower grades, because we don't like to do it later, retention itself may not be the driver, is kind of what this study is saying. Like, is it really the retention? In this case, it's the flagging and the supports. So in 23-24, Michigan actually removed the retention piece of this law. That's what I've got.
Interesting. Although we don't, the question is whether that threat of retention motivates educators to do things. Do we know in Mississippi, we've heard that the fact that they had to tell the parents that their child was below grade level in reading, at risk of being retained. Some people think that had a big impact as part of the Mississippi miracle. Was that part of this here? Did they had to tell parents?
No, I mean, they weren't looking at per se, but it seems like a lot of the evidence would support that theory.
I mean, that parents had to they had to say, well, we may have to retain your child unless you waive this thing. So the parent would, I mean, if it's helpful, if the parent knows, oh, we actually have a big problem here, that is very important.
That's
and
right.
It would be helpful for raising.
And because they could be doing supportive things too now, right? Now that they've gotten that letter.
Right. Absolutely. No. And then what about, I mean, do they talk much like this is during the pandemic? We're going to have all these studies now that are going to have to wrestle with this. I mean, what do you think? Should we take this seriously or is that,
I
does
mean,
that
I
get it
feel like
discounted?
the COVID thing, obviously, we're not holding back hardly any kids, period, right? If anything, we're, kind of relaxing all of these, types of requirements we've made. So I don't like the timing of the study, but I also don't think it negates what it says. I mean, in part because it sort of resonates, I think it just in terms of, they actually had in the appendix all these letters from superintendents and principals that were showing that they were not going to, comply with that part of the law because, they had that ability not to do so. So I can't imagine that outside the pandemic, they're going to change their minds, right? I mean, I feel like they're always, in general, there's a lot of pushback on retention from educators, no matter when a study is conducted.
Yeah, it's starting to feel a little bit like No Child Left Behind, right? Where it's like we've come up with a way to scare people, for lack of a better word, right? But then, the thing that we want to scare them into doing is, frankly, fundamentally unattainable, right? And so after one or two cycles, it becomes clear that compliance is basically non-existent. And then either the policy goes away or people stop taking it seriously. So I don't know. That's one interpretation of what's going on. It's also possible that I don't know, that we just decided to care about reading in second and third grade or whenever the tutoring starts. And that, I don't know, that we can just keep doing that, right? I mean, I don't think the takeaway is necessarily that negative, right? If the takeaway is, look, bundling these policies helped focus attention on this outcome that we think is really crucial. Taking this one piece of the bundle away doesn't necessarily change the outcome that much. I don't think we know that yet, but maybe it might not, right? In which case, great, let's keep focusing on reading in second and third grade. I mean, what else are we going to do? Why weren't we doing that before? It's hard to say.
Yeah,
I think it'd actually be helpful to do a study now that the retention component is off the table. I hope
Right,
they do
I had
that
the
study.
same thought. Right.
Yeah.
Can you still do the RD if there's no threat of retention? I don't know.
Oh, that's right.
You can do
it does make it harder.
It's very fuzzy.
But your point is right, David. And it's, all bark and no bite works maybe for a year or two. And then, people are on to you. So it's an issue. It's an issue. All right, gang. Well, that is all the time we've got for this week. But thank you, Amber, for bringing us that study.
Indeed.
Very nice. Okay, but until next week.
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.